We want to start with the special creative and entrepreneurial energy that's happening here in Los Angeles. The West Coast of the United States has long been a source of some of the most innovative companies on the planet. Think Disney, think Uber, and Snapchat. But more recently, entrepreneurs from abroad are choosing to move their businesses here to Los Angeles, creating a special convergence of technologies, ideas, and creativity. To explore why different industries are colliding here in Los Angeles, please welcome Rich Pierson, co-founder and CEO of Headspace, who moved his entire business here from London, Damian Bradfield, president of WeTransfer, who first set up his business in Amsterdam and now has moved here to LA. We also have Bettina Korek, executive director of Frieze LA, who just held their first edition of Frieze in February. And they'll be in conversation with Rohan Silva, who is setting up the first outpost of Second Home here in Los Angeles.
Well, thank you, Imran. It's a huge pleasure to be here. My name is Rohan Silva. I'm co-founder of Second Home. We're a creative workspace company launching in LA this September. We're kind of like the anti-WeWork. And I've got to admit, I'm slightly obsessed with this topic of convergence. You know, what happens when different ideas and industries collide and come together? And I could definitely blather on this stage for the next 5 hours on this topic. But luckily, as Imran's saying, we have three great entrepreneurs who can share their thoughts and ideas on this important topic. And you know, I wonder, Damian, whether we could kick off with you. WeTransfer, you know, you build tools that help people share ideas. Started off nominally as a sort of technology business. Tell us a bit about how you at WeTransfer work with other industries, other disciplines, and why you do that.
The thing that most people don't know about WeTransfer that actually is the most interesting thing is that we have an advertising model that's a full screen image in the background. If any of you use a desktop and not a mobile, I know in LA everyone's on their phone, but if you ever use a desktop still, you'll see WeTransfer this massive image in the background. And most of our revenue comes from advertising. So we spend a lot of time working with the luxury goods industry and working with companies in technology from Adobe to Vimeo and Moo.com, those sort of guys. And then the most exciting part is 30% of all of our advertising we give away to support projects. So artists, photographers, musicians, anything really that's sort of interesting, and especially in the charitable space or projects that are around social cause, gun reform. We're doing a big project at the moment about homelessness in LA. And that's the piece that's really interesting, I think, about WeTransfer, and where we connect on multiple levels with everybody, really. 60 million people use our tools. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to come back, especially on the sort of charity point to you, Damian. But Bettina runs Frieze Art Fair LA, which has just been a roaring success in the city. You know, the art world, I guess, is one where people might think, right, the art world's fairly insular at times. You know, artists hang out with artists. Tell us about some of the things you did at Frieze to open out the conversation and bring about that convergence.
Well, my background is really convergence within the art world. I've been lucky enough to wear many hats working with different organizations, from for and nonprofit galleries and museums to directly with artists. And Frieze was this moment where we could really experiment with how different kinds of collaborations can result in new forms of art patronage. Frieze's strategic partner is Endeavor. So just with that, it was so interesting to kind of see how these different cultures interacted, and bringing an art fair to Hollywood, to a city which is just really in the past 10 or 15 years become conscious of how important it is as an art destination. You know, there were so many conversations and kind of sustained relationships that have been built that I think will continue to place Frieze at the center of the convergence between different creative fields in LA.
And you, Rich, you know, so Headspace, I'm sure lots of you use Headspace. I did just this morning, you know, leading meditation app. Again, you know, started off as a technology business. Tell us about some of the ways you're trying to think in a more interdisciplinary way as you grow.
Well, we actually started off as an event business. So we put on events in London, and my co-founder used to be a Tibetan Buddhist monk. So the convergence of 2,500 years of Tibetan Buddhism to an event, to an app, was quite a transition. And I think those three worlds you wouldn't necessarily imagine kind of coming together. I think the irony, the fact that we've got close to 50 million people on a phone, and the phone is the thing that's causing us a lot of our stress, is not lost on us. But I think what's been particularly interesting is how that started to transfer into places that in a speed that we wouldn't have expected. So we're in now the 4 largest school districts in the US. We make it freely available for teachers. And we're actually now starting to become part of the healthcare system. So if you think by 2030, mental health care costs are going to exceed diabetes, respiratory illness, and cancer combined, you cannot train enough human beings to be able to serve that need. So I think we're going to have to come up with ways that technology can help scale that. And it's these worlds that are coming together that wouldn't traditionally, monk healthcare technology. And I think for me and for Andy and the team, that's a really interesting kind of place to be.
And as you're evolving and being more and more open to other fields like healthcare, what does that mean for your team? Are you having to kind of push yourself to recruit people from different worlds? What does it mean in practice for you?
Well, I'd say that the team at Headspace is very multidisciplinary. We've got, so Dr. Megan Jones-Bell, our Chief Science Officer, she runs all of our science research work, as well as Headspace Healthcare, which is a completely separate subsidiary. And she's built a team of behavioral scientists for on the product side. We've got economists that are working purely on, if you use Headspace, what is the ROI for the healthcare costs? Like, can you actually reduce healthcare costs by using that product? Plus brilliant creatives, technologists. So we've had to put a very diverse set of talents from all over the world, and we hire from all over the world. They come to LA, and we look all over the world for talent. That brings challenges, because they think about the problem in a very different way. And the tension, I think, is what gives it its creativity and what makes it great. But there is tension. And I think that's where the magic is, but it's a hard thing to navigate for folks.
Yeah. I'm interested, Imran, at the opening, talked about this magic that's happening in LA, which you're all very much part of and driving. Bettina, you weren't born in LA, but you're certainly bred in this city. What do you think is going on right now on this sort of theme of convergence? Why now? Why is this conversation maybe so relevant at this moment?
Well, LA has always been where people come to reimagine themselves and reinvent themselves. Mike Davis, who wrote one of the greatest books about LA, says it's a city that's infinitely envisioned. And I think it's that combination of the stereotype of the Wild West still being very true, that anything can happen here. I saw Doug Aitken yesterday, and he brought up this point that cities are usually emerge around trade routes, and LA is about the trade of images and the production of images. And since the emergence of social media culture, we're all in the image trade. And I think that is part of why so many different industries and creatives are coming here and really cross-pollinating in ways that aren't happening in other cities.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, as you can probably tell from Damian's accent, well, and mine and Rich's, we weren't certainly not born in LA. But Damian, what's your perspective on sort of convergence in this city? Why are you here?
I fucking love LA. Who doesn't love LA? It's
Who doesn't love
amazing.
LA? And what do you think is so conducive here to this type of convergence?
So look, I mean, even this is a crappy day in LA. I mean, if you come from where I come from, this is the best day of the year.
Yeah, this is serious beach
Let's start
weather.
with something very basic.
Yeah.
Then you've got $96 billion of film being commissioned in this city this year between Apple, Netflix, Hulu, HBO, everybody else. I mean, the creative drive that's coming from London, from New York, from Paris, that used to be very transient, is now setting up and setting down roots in this city. The opportunity here is ridiculous. I mean, if you go to New York, you can't find a building, for less than $50 a square foot, where it isn't already on the 20th floor. I mean, with the exception of this area, most of LA is not even beyond 2 stories. So the opportunity in this city to build, to actually expand and to go upwards and outwards is phenomenal. And I think people are beginning to recognize that San Francisco is ridiculously expensive and vacuous. New York is unbelievably expensive and perhaps just overpopulated. And LA is this place where everything is coming together. And traditionally, this industry that was based around film is now becoming film and fashion and music and arts. I mean, Frieze is a prime example of what's really coming this way that they've talked about for a long time, but hasn't necessarily been here. And as part of the sort of tech community, there was talk of Silicon Beach. I don't think Silicon Beach is really there, but there's somewhere between, Venice, Santa Monica, Culver City, that's just sprawling throughout this city, and luckily it's blending itself into all those different pockets, and that's what makes LA exciting, that it isn't just that little hub where you get everybody looking and dressing the same. It's all sort of mashed up, and we're in the West, so I guess that's different, but generally it's a bit of a mashup.
And look, I don't want this just to be a sort of come by our session, because the fact is, the truth is that convergence, this cross-pollination between fields, is so conducive to innovation, and yet it actually doesn't happen as often as you'd like. You're all great exemplars of it in your organizations. But Rich, I wonder what you think some of the barriers are to this way of working. What have you found difficult, genuinely, about this interdisciplinary approach?
I think it's just I think people get very used to working in a certain way, and I think the problem is when you put disparate skill sets together, you actually have to come up with new ways of working, and I think people come from certain companies with a certain way of doing things, and they've been successful doing that, so they want to imprint it. So the really hard thing is finding what are the cultural values that are important that you're not willing to kind of give up on, and then be more flexible around the systems that you use to create. Right. And I don't think we've always got that right. It's really hard. Yeah. And I think your natural inclination is actually to lean out of it because it's hard and it's messy. But I don't think that you come up. I've never been involved in a great creative project where you're really proud of the result and it hasn't been really messy and really difficult. Right. And I think that there is I think that's an unusual acceptance for folks. I don't think that people want to accept that yes. part of the process. And so I think that's why people shy away from it, and they naturally go with what they feel comfortable with. And I think it's just like human nature. Yeah, right. I mean, Bettina, you must encounter this a lot at Frieze and at For Your Art. You're working with artists, but also helping them interact with business and other worlds. There must be times when actually these two viewpoints don't always mesh together as well as. How do you navigate that? How do you get through that?
I think your point about the flexibility of systems is something I think a lot about, working with organizations like the Getty and trying to, have empathy about how they're used to working and try to kind of frame things in their language. I find that businesses in different industries are often talking about the same thing, but it comes down to how they frame that. And in the art world, we really value process and embrace it, and that's what that messiness is. And I think when we go into projects, part of it is also being candid about what it means to work with an artist and how that's different.
Damian, have there been any, for you, working with artists and so on, I'm interested, what have you found difficult? Have there been times when you've thought, sod this, it's just too hard, it's not worth it. This morning.
Yeah, before I got on stage.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. But it can't always be easy.
No, but I think maybe it's partly sadistic, but the hard ones are the best ones. There's a few artists that we worked with that we knew going into the relationship was going to be really tough, and I think they're generally the best ones, right? They're the ones you have to work hardest for because those artists are protecting something that they hold very dear to themselves. I think it'd be the same and we don't work in fine art, but I think it's the same in fine art. When something is given up too easily, it's just not that much, there isn't that much value in it. And we've worked with, in the last 2 years, with Bjork and with FK Twigs. And both of them, are not the easiest people in the world, but the reward is huge. But the process is hard. But I don't know it should be any different. I don't know there's a way around that.
Would you tell us all a bit about, say, the collaboration with Bjork? Really, really exciting.
So Prince in 2015 shared an album from Judith Hill on WeTransfer, and he basically went to Live Nation and said, I want to promote an artist and I want to send it out in the world. And Live Nation went, nah. So he just created a short link on WeTransfer and sent it out on Twitter, and basically built up the career of Judith Hill at that time. And Prince, was at the forefront of so many things, but he basically created this sort of vehicle for us that got us into music and into a space that we weren't really that familiar with. We'd done a lot of design and a lot of creativity, but music was relatively new. But we did it really because we had someone like Prince and Moby and Azealia Banks naturally sharing work through our platform. And this takes me to a place which is all about trust. And I think the fact that our service doesn't really collect any data, and we don't really retarget anybody, and we don't have a sign up, and we do all these things that a lot of tech companies don't do, it enables a huge amount of trust on our service. And it meant that a relationship with Bjork was relatively easy to do, which it isn't for a lot of companies. And we made a film with her and Jesse Kanda, and it was promoted on We Present, which is our long-form storytelling platform. And again, someone like Bjork has still got so much kudos, and she represents so much more than music. I mean, I always say that there's like Bjork, FK Twigs, people like David Bowie, they weren't musicians, they were artists, and the work that they were doing was so much bigger than just music that it's a gift that we get to work with them.
So given that we're all, it's amazing, right? Given that all of you are passionate about this idea of convergence, I wonder what you think cities like LA could be doing to help drive this agenda forward, remove some of the barriers and make it easier. LA is in lots of ways still a very segregated city and so on. Bettina, what do you think could change in this city?
Well, I think Damian brought up an interesting point inadvertently about the verticality of New York. LA is relatively horizontal, and I think this resistance to hierarchy between disciplines is a really important also part of why people come together here more in different ways. That opportunity for sustained relationships, I think one-offs between disciplines don't necessarily work, and it's the things that happen organically out of relationships that emerge, like working at places like Second Home, which will be, an indoor-outdoor architectural oasis filled with thousands of trees. And those are the kinds of places that are so unique to Los Angeles. So it's a combination, I think, of embracing the character of the city as this place where anything can happen. And certainly on a civic level, the general consciousness about how important creativity is as an asset continues to grow. The Otis report on the creative economy looks at the contributions of film, fashion, art to the state economy, and so that's already happening. But my point of view is it's finding real organic synergies between different kinds of organizations and focusing on cultivating those.
Yeah. Rich, what's your take? What do you think we could be doing? As a group, amazing leaders all around us. If we want to see more of this kind of convergence in the world, more industries coming together and interacting and so on, more perspectives, what kind of things should we be doing?
I think it's going to happen naturally. I don't think that businesses are going to be able to survive unless they work together. I think the days of we're over here on our own playing by ourselves and not bringing other people in, I think you'll die as a business. So I think naturally it will happen. And I just think that the younger generations that are coming through, they naturally work like that. They've been brought up in a way where they share everything and they work on everything together. They create together. So I just think you can't get away from it. It's an inevitability. I think in LA, if you could fix the traffic problem, it'd be a massive thing. So I do think autonomous vehicles will make a big difference. I do think in London, that's the most exciting thing for me is when LA doesn't have traffic.
Yeah.
Because I think in London, New York, there's more natural places to bump into people, to go and meet, and it just takes a lot of effort here to go to another part of town. And I think that's part of the reason why people stay in their areas, which, that has a lot of disadvantages, and I don't think that helps creativity or collaboration at at all. So it's like a very practical one. But
No, it's true. Second Home, we're going to be in East Hollywood precisely because we hope it's somewhere that different disciplines and sort of tribes can converge. But it's really hard to find somewhere in the city that.
Yeah.
I mean, what's your take on this, Damian? You know, how do you think we can see more of this kind of cross-pollination in the world? What if you're running an organization, you're a CEO, or you're running a department, as I'm sure everyone in this audience in different ways is running something. How should we act differently in our organizations to be open to this?
And so I think public transport is huge. But the second thing that I think as a tech company is we should look at San Francisco and just say, we're not gonna fucking do that.
Yeah.
So if we just look there and then basically do the opposite,
Right.
I think we'll be all good.
And what does the opposite mean?
Where do we start? So culture, investments in art, in museums, in gallery, in cultural spaces, and in spaces where people can actually get together and share work that isn't just for the super elite. Making sure that, LA is so diverse that you don't just have a panel of people like me, but there's a very mixed panel of people talking and sharing their feedback and opinions. I think is super important. I think there needs to be a certain amount of investment, and that investment needs to come not from the traditional, routes of just investing and making sure you're going to get a return in 3 or 5 years. But there are companies like the Media Network that are investing in 2 strands. One is in financial return, and one is on social return. And I think if companies and investment, the VCs, can look at San Francisco and say, we're not going to do that, but we're going to actually invest in companies that are really going to try and fulfill a social mission as well as a business. I do believe in profit for purpose, but a social mission, I think it would be game changing. But I really do mean it. Just don't do what San Francisco did.
Right. Bettina, one of the things we really think a lot about Second Home is convergence, not just between different industries, but also the for-profit sector and the not-for-profit sector, and government and business and so on. At Frieze, I know that's also a line that you're sort of straddling. Why do you think, again, that's quite a fertile domain between those sectors?
Well, Frieze is an art fair. The heart of the event is in Los Angeles. 70 galleries from around the world come together at Paramount Studios. But my personal passion for it, and I think what we already saw in this first year, was what the potential of Frieze Week had to create energy and an access point for people all over the city to go to galleries, to go to museums. So it is about how art events can be a catalyst for energy and people coming together and getting out of there. To your point, I've lived here almost all of my life. And there were people that I tried to get to go to museums. They'd be like, is LACMA the one downtown, or is that near the tar pits? Frieze happened, and they were coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
So, I think embracing, again, like we live in this culture where urgency and events kind of bring a different dimension, and it's how can you leverage that energy to have an impact beyond what's happening in the center.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Rich, I'd be really interested in all of your takes, actually, starting with you on, who should we be looking at? So obviously there's Headspace and Frieze and WeTransfer, but who do you really admire in this domain of interdisciplinarity, of convergence? Who should we all be looking at, Googling this evening and so on, and looking up?
Well, it might be an obvious one, but I just think the way that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have attacked some of the world's biggest problems using the best of philanthropy, the best of business, the best of science, the best of government. I think they've done some incredible work, especially around malaria.
Yeah.
And the way that they've really focused in on how do we solve that problem. So saying we're only going to work on things that cost less than $100 per person. Like they could spend their money anywhere, but they're going, unless we can solve a problem around that, we're not going to do it.
Right.
And the simple act of malaria nets, and I don't know if you saw recently, we are going to potentially live in a world where malaria is not going to exist.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
And so I think that is the perfect example of applying a different process and approach to a very big problem, but everyone coming together. They haven't been able to do that with just money. they've had to have governments and healthcare systems and scientists come together to solve that. And for me, they're just, I just think they're doing incredible work.
Brilliant. Bettina, who do you really sort of admire in this domain of converging?
For me, it's Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who is a curator based in London, but he's kind of a human Facebook. He thrives on bringing people from different fields together, the arts, philosophy, literature, science, economics, based on their common interests. And
he introduced us, in fact.
He introduced us. You know, he followed a curator who wrote in the early 20th century that to understand the forces at work in art, you have to understand what's happening outside of it. And I think that's really the future.
Yeah. He's an amazing guy. He talks a lot about junction making, which is another way of talking about convergence. The way he drives a lot of that is he calls you up at 3 in the morning and says, it's urgent, you'll talk to my friend Bettina. And that's how this convergence happens. Damien, how about you? You mentioned Bowie and FKA Twigs and Bjork as sort of emblematic of convergence. Who else should we be looking up and looking up to?
So I'm going to answer your question differently. I'll tell you the companies you shouldn't be looking at.
Okay.
Amazon, Facebook, Google. I think any company basically that's got individuals running those companies that have got 2 classes of shares and are personally worth $98 billion, something like that. I think we should be really questioning what we're doing with them and whether we want to see them succeed in the future, and encouraging them to do something with that wealth. I think there are plenty of companies. Yeah, there are loads of companies we can get inspiration from, but in order for that inspiration to actually become something, that money needs to be distributed. And I think it's going to be down to you guys to force those companies to do something about it and distribute some of that wealth and put it back into the marketplace and actually do some good. Put it into a fucking museum. Give it to Frieze. Do something decent with it.
All right, well, on that bombshell, I thank you so much for being here. Huge thank you to BoF. This topic of convergence, I think, is so symbolic of LA in this moment, and it's really exciting to be here with Second Home and to be here with Rich and Bettina and Damian. So please give them a big round of applause.